I recall many years ago when I was treating patients with insomnia, we'd see people in clinic who were being tested with polysomnography, and they'd fall asleep quickly. They'd stay asleep mostly throughout the night, and in the morning they would report that they slept horribly, that they were up half the night. And I remember showing the tracings to some of these patients and saying, no, here is where you fell asleep, and maybe that was within 3 minutes of putting them into bed, and you slept pretty much throughout the night. And I remember one woman telling me that there must be something wrong with my machine.
Right.
I guess I'm also I'm wondering also on the flip side is, are the patient's self-impressions so strong that no matter what you tell them, it may not influence them?
Right. Right. No, it certainly could be. I mean, I would like to believe that there is a physiologic mechanism behind that. And, one of the things that we're looking at in that study that I told you about is that, we're trying to see if maybe those types of patients may have more cortical arousals, more brain awakenings that don't reach the full level of consciousness. Not like, they wake up multiple times a night, but it's triggering their brain to think that they're awake. And so when they wake up, they're not well rested, they're grumpy, and they don't feel like they've slept. And that's why they're driving, why they're reporting such limited sleep when, by some of the measures that we have, PSG included, it looks like they're asleep. And so we're looking to dig into that a little bit. But, I think this idea, this concept of, a patient's experience of themselves and what we can measure in the real world, and we use that term philosophically loosely, but what we can measure goes far beyond sleep, right? This happens in performance all the time. We're doing some research showing, asking people to do these cognitive tests while we measure some of their other body responses, and then when we ask them how well they think they did versus how well they actually did on the test, there's sometimes huge discrepancies there, right? And so there are people that have biases in terms of how they view themselves, both positive and negative. And the magnitude of that discrepancy also varies a lot by individuals. So yeah, I think that there are phenotypes of people. There are people out there for whom their perception of themselves is so strong that it's going to be unwavered by any objective data that you provide them. Yes, I believe those people sort of exist. I would like to think about and learn sort of what the causal sort of physiologic underpinnings to that are, because I think it's fascinating, right? It gets back to my core interest in terms of understanding the mind-body sort of relationship. So,
you mentioned that some clinical trials fail because the self-report data don't pan out. Is the idea in giving information about the objective results to the patient to give them a tighter or more accurate subjective report that could then produce better outcomes in clinical trials?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what we're trying to do is remove non-disease, non-treatment effects to their report, right? And and I'm sure you've experienced this before, the parking lot effect, where everybody fills out their diary right before they walk in the door for the clinical trial. What we're trying to do is anchor them with something that again it can be inaccurate, right? Like, we know devices are imperfect by a lot in some cases, but the idea is that by providing them some sort of anchor, they can over time sort of look at that anchor, look at what the device said, know what it said in the sort of past and how it's felt, and then sort of tighten the variability from the patient's report to really get closer to something that might be a truer estimation of their sleep. So yeah, exactly right. We are trying to constrain the variability, to remove all those parking lot effects and mood effects and all that sort of stuff by providing them that piece of information, and ideally, right, making a more efficient clinical trial that can really help patients. Because I think there's probably quite a few sleep treatments out there that didn't make it because the endpoints are very messy and then very hard to deal with, and a lot of patients didn't get treatments that or kept from getting treatments that could really help them just because of a data collection problem, right? Not because the drug or the treatment doesn't work.
In sleep medicine, what kind of information do you pass on to the patient?
So in the sleep diary right now, we're looking at just a couple, two key pieces of information. One is how long did you think you slept? So in the industry, as you know, we would refer that to as total sleep time. So that's time that you were asleep during the night. And then the other really important one is what we call sleep onset latency, and that is from the time that you try to sleep until the time you actually fell asleep. And again, for us, that's an extreme case of where there could be a subjective and objective sort of mismatch, because sleep is obviously a very complex phenomena, and this idea of being unconscious and trying to recount that is sort of the extreme case here. But we could, yeah. So that's those are the two pieces of information that we're working with now, and getting into that already is enough complexity for us.
Outside of the field of sleep, would you envision other types of objective information that you could pass on to the patient that might improve their subjective ratings, say in depression or anxiety or other areas of neuroscience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fascinating that you brought up depression. Some wonderful work out of Minnesota did this several years ago, where they asked people, they did a voice recording and perhaps a video, I can't remember that specific detail, of a patient at baseline, depression patient at baseline. They did an interview and they recorded the patient. Then they had a randomized control study, placebo versus treatment. And what they showed in the studies what they did at the end was they replayed the videos for the patient of themselves, right? So they said, here's where you were at baseline. Now rate yourselves, rate your improvement, your depression improvement since that time. And what they showed was greater separation between placebo and treatment for patients that were given that condition, or that were given that sort of that baseline rewatching of the video, right? And so I think certainly there's applications there. I mean, you could probably expand the same thing to anxiety and other places. We're thinking about it, just given the types of devices that I work with. We're looking at it in pain, for example, or fibromyalgia. So, if we show somebody how active they were during the day, how many steps they've taken, how might that influence their pain rating over time? So looking at a few different nuances there. But yeah, I think that conceptually, that idea is applicable broadly across a number of different conditions, particularly where, treatment outcomes are relegated to subjective, largely subjective type endpoints.
Yeah, well, and of course, which we know is true in the field of sleep medicine. We do have a gold standard. We have polysomnography as an objective measure, but we don't have that in so many other areas of psychiatry, for example. So the subjective report or self-report is really the basis on which efficacy will be assessed.
Right.
Would you imagine that this kind of approach would influence clinical trial designs in general going forward? If you had to think about how this might be introduced in a general way in clinical trial designs, how would it influence it?
Yeah. The primary hope here is that you can get faster, smaller studies, right? Because the idea is, if you can tighten up the variances of the data that you're looking at, that you'll be able to separate signal from noise with fewer patients over much less time, and show sort of clear benefit. So I think that's the biggest clinical trial implication that we're thinking about from the diagnostic side. I mean, there is, something we haven't talked about a whole lot, but there is sort of a therapeutic side to this too. It could be very well the case that if you provide people veridical data, and we'll leave aside again this idea of if you give them, falsified data and that sort of thing, but if you give them veridical data, at least preliminarily, we see some treatment effects. We see patients with insomnia reporting less insomnia once, I hate to say forced to reconcile with, but almost that is almost the case, that, when they have to look at their data night after night, and, the device is reporting these types of things, we see people's subjective report sort of improve. And so, in terms of a clinical trial, there's also the thoughts of a clinical trial around that. How could this technology be used as a treatment? And so we're looking at that too, although that's probably a few years out.
Well, it's fascinating. In today's conversation, I've learned a little bit more about med tech than I knew before, and a little bit more about the importance of both objective and subjective data in clinical trials, and really the critical nature of subjective data, and trying to improve the ways we do those assessments. And I think what you just referenced in terms of using smaller sample sizes and being able to get good data from smaller sample sizes because there's less variability in the data certainly makes sense. I'm also wondering about applications here in decentralized trials. If we're looking at self-report data, is it that much more feasible to do these assessments with patients in their home environments?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of the that's one of the big benefits of using sensors and mobile devices to collect these data is that, you're basically talking about shipping a wearable device or some more very easy to use device and a cell phone to someone, and they can complete their diaries, they can put on the device, and so you get access to a much wider swath of patients that aren't nested around some huge clinical trial site and sort of that traditional sort of PI investigator model, but really it's almost completely decentralized at that point, right? And we're almost at a place where I think a lot of very, very, very many clinical trials outside of a few specialized areas could be almost completely decentralized.
Anything else that you would want to add for our audience about med tech and device development?
Sure. I mean, I think the future is bright. That's all. That's my main message is that we are lucky to be in a world with very many talented scientists and engineers. And it's every day that I see interesting new innovations all the way from material science to the way we design sensors to adhere to the skin and the molecular differences there that are improving our signal quality to better AI algorithms and voluminous amounts of data. I think the future is very, very bright, and I'm really excited to be part of the field. Really excited to be part of the field.
Wonderful. We have appreciated very much working with you and the innovations that you've brought to us at Clinilabs. It's really been interesting. And today's conversation has been really interesting to me as well. I've learned a lot about tech and devices. So I thank you for being with me today and for having this talk.
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's always a pleasure hanging out with you and talking shop with you. Do it anytime.